All right, we're going to go ahead and get started because it's 2:02 p.m. and Erin is waiting, and she's our presenter today, and I don't want to keep her waiting. So, Erin, I never can remember your exact title. If it's manager or coordinator or whatever it is, I just know that you are over several refuges, and are going to tell us. And I've heard part of. I've been in and out of FOB when Erin was presenting, and she has a wonderful presentation. I'm really anxious for us to hear it. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Erin Cox. And Erin, I'm not sharing anything right now. You're free to share your screen whenever you're ready. And tell us what you do and what we should be doing.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for the invite, first and foremost. First of all, just by way of introduction, my official title is Refuge Manager, and I'm now over Black Bayou, Upper Washita, Darbone, and Handy Break refuges. And so I've been here about 4 years or so. And before that, I was at Tensas for 5 years. I was the assistant manager there. So I don't have any direct connection to Tensas right now in terms of management or anything like that, but we're all part of the same complex, which I'll kind of talk about as well. And Tensas is just so near and dear to my heart, and I have a lot of Tensas information in this presentation itself too. Let me see if I can move this over here so that I'm not looking over to look at you all. That might make it.
We can't hear you, Erin. Did you actually?
Presentation. Pardon?
We couldn't hear you there for a minute. I wondered if you accidentally muted yourself.
Oh,
now I
can you hear me now? Okay.
Yeah, hearing you now loud and clear.
Okay, perfect. Well, I'm at the visitor center at Black Bayou, and sometimes the internet here gets a little spotty, but I can switch over to Wi-Fi if it continues. So just let me know.
Am I confused?
What was that? Oh, okay. So I kind of run the gamut in this presentation because what I always try to do with these things is, first of all, introduce people to the Fish and Wildlife Service as a whole, because we're a very lesser known agency and part of kind of the grand scheme, the picture of public land management as a whole. And so I have just a quick introduction to refuges and to how we operate, and kind of a history of conservation in this country and how we've gotten to where we are.
We lost you again, Erin. Yeah, we lost her completely now. I'm going to suggest that everybody turn off their video except Erin when she gets back on, because that will help with the bandwidth issue. And so if we will just all mute our videos, and I hope that she'll be back in a minute.
I think I'm back.
You're back now. And I've asked everybody to mute our video. That will help preserve bandwidth for you, Erin. So
okay, well, and I will.
Go ahead.
Okay. And I will stop my video as well and see if does that impact the screen?
I don't share your screen again and let us see if we got to be able to see your screen.
Okay. Is it showing?
It's coming. It says has started. There it is. Yes, we can see your screen. Perfect.
Okay. All right. Well, then we will just try this. That way y'all won't have to look at my face either. All right. So here we go. All right. So first of all, just again, by way of introduction, what is a national wildlife refuge? And so right now I'm sitting on Black Bayou Lake National Wildlife Refuge. We have several refuges in the area. Tensas River is very well known, but people don't tend to know or understand what a refuge actually is. So sometimes it's easier to tell them what it's not. So it's not a park of any kind. We're not a city park, not a county park. We're not a national park. And we're also not a wildlife management area, which is another kind of easily confused kind of entity with these. And so the wildlife management areas like Russell Sage and some other ones in the area, they're actually managed by the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. And we work very closely with them as kind of our state partners and state cohorts, but they are not over our refuges. So these refuges are federal property. So they are your refuges. We operate under the Department of the Interior, and we have sister agencies that are a lot more well-known than the Fish and Wildlife Service is. And those include the National Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and all these other Department of the Interior agencies are our kind of sister agencies. And so my agency is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Fish and Wildlife Service as a whole is responsible for many different facets of wildlife management. So we have the refuge system itself, which is probably the most well-known. I would say it's more likely the poster child. But another arm of the Fish and Wildlife Service is we deal with threatened and endangered species and permitting. And anytime a federal project impacts critical habitat for an endangered species, Fish and Wildlife Service is the one who determines mitigations and things like that. So those are just two of kind of the better known parts of the Fish and Wildlife Service. And we wear a lot of hats. But on refuges specifically, which is my bread and butter, our mission is to administer a national network of lands and waters for the conservation, management, and where appropriate restoration of fish, wildlife, plant resources, and their habitats. So we are really the only system of federal lands that were established specifically for wildlife conservation. Now, there's a lot of other federal agencies that deal with wildlife. The Forest Service under the Department of Agriculture, obviously they allow hunting, they manage for threatened and endangered species on their land, but refuges under the Fish and Wildlife Service are the only system of federal lands that are specifically for wildlife conservation. And so currently we have over 560 refuges in all 50 states, Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, Guam, and we have several marine national monuments as well that honestly, I don't know how you manage them. I think it's more or less just a, here you go, enjoy. But all told, it's about 850 million acres. And so I'm a very visual person. I don't know how well this will show up. But I did want to just kind of show you all the scope of what we're dealing with. And Alaska obviously is the biggest place where you can find refuges and has the most acres. But for the most part, I think this is probably a better map to kind of show you all. And we'll get into the history of the agency just a little bit as well. These refuges have really been established around flyways. And so they've been very kind of waterfowl centric. You can see these concentrations up along the coasts, along the Mississippi Flyway and through the Central Valley. And that's really been the bread and butter of the Fish and Wildlife Service and refuges in general, is along these flyways. So in Louisiana, we have several. Like I mentioned, up in the north part of the state, we have them stretching from Red River all the way to Tensas, several in central Louisiana, and then several down on the coast. And again, if you think about it in that waterfowl context, especially like Cameron Prairie, Sabine, and the Marsh, those are huge waterfowl resources. And then you get up into North Louisiana, and you get into the Mississippi Alluvial Valley along the Ouachita and Red Rivers. And again, it's highly waterfowl centric. So just by way of quick history, and I promise we'll get to our actual refuges here shortly. I just really enjoy getting on this soapbox here for a minute and helping people kind of understand the history and how we got to where we are. But for the refuge system itself, and really wildlife conservation in general, if we start kind of in the mid to late 1800s, there was unrestricted harvest of wildlife for food, fashion, and commerce. And that's really kind of what it boiled down to. And what it resulted in was the near extinction of, well, it's telling me my internet connection is unstable. Hopefully it's still showing up. But what we got was the near extinction of bison herds. We ended up with the extinction of the passenger pigeon, the wading bird populations, especially like in Florida and along the coastlines, that were absolutely decimated for feathers, for the hat trade and things like that. And so by the turn of the century to 1900, we were really in pretty dire straits in terms of wildlife populations. And so at this point, there was increasing public awareness of these problems. And interestingly enough, it was largely driven by hunters and sportsmen. And so you saw the foundation of these clubs like the Boone and Crockett Club, which now today is associated with trophy deer and trophy hunting and things like that. But it was actually founded by explorers, writers, scientists, politicians, including Teddy Roosevelt, who was just huge for conservation in general. And so that itself really was a driving force for this public awareness of where we were at in terms of this unrestricted use of our wildlife resources. At this point, you also started seeing the establishment of the American Ornithologist Union, National Audubon Society, and several of these other groups that are still well known today for conservation. So I'll probably just go kind of quickly. I don't want to, this is not a memorize these dates and there'll be a test at the end. But in 1903, Teddy Roosevelt established the first actual national wildlife refuge. It was called something different, but it became a national wildlife refuge at Pelican Island in Florida. And then the second one was actually here in Louisiana at Breton, down on the Breton Island. Not sure, it's like the Chandelier Islands, but anyway, down in the coast in the Gulf. And so these early refuges were mostly very small, and they focused on protecting these populations of colonial water birds. And these water birds, these egrets and herons, are what were being harvested in just massive numbers for the feather trade and for things like that. And so by 1909, when Roosevelt left office, he had issued 51 executive orders and established all these wildlife reservations in 17 states and 3 territories, which is pretty incredible when you think about it. I mean, he is definitely one of the driving forces for conservation among presidents of this country, no doubt about it. And so we move on, we get the Migratory Bird Act, Migratory Bird Treaty Act, that both address the overharvest of birds for market hunting. And then at this point, once we started kind of checking these boxes for protecting populations of animals, we started thinking about protecting habitat. It was very much a paradigm shift in that people started realizing that as the population of this country is growing and as wildlife habitat was being converted to other uses, whether agricultural, whether being urbanized, it really started kind of sinking in that we need to be thinking broader scale for the future. And so in 1934, we get the Duck Stamp Act. And the Duck Stamp is still, to this day, one of the single best things, in my opinion, that you can do as an individual for conservation. Because when you go and you buy your Duck Stamp, 98 cents of every single dollar goes directly back to either purchase land for the refuge system or to purchase easements from private property. And that is just incredible. I mean, what other government program can you think of where 98 cents of every dollar actually goes to the purpose that people are using it for? And so I encourage everyone, whether or not you hunt, whether you're a bird watcher, whether you just enjoy conservation in general and making sure that these places are protected, I encourage everyone to buy your Duck Stamp every year. It's a powerful, powerful tool. So we'll fast forward a little bit, and this is again refuge system centric, we start getting these pieces of legislation that really what they say is they recognize that these refuges were set aside for particular purposes, and that is for wildlife observation or for wildlife habitat and protection. And so what it has done with this Refuge Recreation Act of 1962 and then later legislation in 1966 and 1997 is it's basically helped me as a manager to kind of drill down to realize that we do not have to allow anything and everything on a refuge just because it's public land. And that in and of itself is very, very different from, for example, the Forest Service, which operates under a multiple use philosophy. For us, so if someone comes to me and says, hey, I want to have a bicycle race on Black Bayou, I have the power to say no or yes by looking at the compatibility and appropriateness of an action. So basically what this is saying is that some refuges were established for endangered species. And so obviously you want people kept completely out. You have refuges that are a quarter of an acre and it's an entrance to a cave and there's an endangered cave salamander that lives there. Obviously, you're not going to allow any public access into that place. But there are other refuges like Black Bayou, for example, where you can allow other public uses and it does not have negative effects on wildlife or the habitat. And so this just basically gave us a framework of governance essentially to be able to allow certain public uses and public activities on refuges. But what it also did was it established for us these big 6 priority public uses. And so these are public uses that we are supposed to allow when we can, when it does not interfere with our wildlife first mission, and we don't have to go through any special approval processes or anything like that. And so these big 6, and you'll hear anybody in the refuge system talk about the big 6 a lot. We have hunting, fishing, wildlife observation, wildlife photography, environmental education, interpretation. There's no hierarchy. There's none of these 6 that are more important than the others. And again, it all drills down to management decisions. So that's enough about that. That's my little spiel on history and governance and why we sometimes say no when people approach us with different uses for refuges. So coming back to this map of Louisiana, I'm going to drill down just a little bit more to our refuges here. And so we operate under what's called the North Louisiana Refuges Complex. And it includes those 6 refuges now. We just added Tensas a couple years ago into the fold. And it stretches from literally the Red River almost in Texas to Tensas River almost in Mississippi. And they're all managed as this one management unit. It's basically managed as an administrative unit. And so within our complex, we have one project leader who's over basically everything. He's our big boss. And then I manage Black Bayou, Darbone, Upper Washita, Handy Break. There's another manager that manages Red River, and then a third manager over Tensas River. And that's kind of how we break apart. So the 3 of us have kind of the day-to-day management and logistics for all of our different refuges. So even though I'm not over Tensas anymore, I'm still going to talk about it because it's amazing. I included this aerial. I always include this aerial photograph whenever I'm talking about Tensas because it really, really shows how this refuge is almost a literal island of trees and a sea of agriculture. And so you can imagine 100 years ago, it would have been trees everywhere, really 200 years ago. 100 years ago, we were thick in cotton country. But, excuse me, the refuge, and it's over kind of on the left side of your screen. It's aside from the Mississippi River, it is the biggest block of bottomland hardwoods anywhere around. It also includes this picture. I don't have the boundaries up, but there's Big Lake Wildlife Management Area, which adds about another 20,000 acres. and it's managed by the state on the southwest corner of the refuge. And so it makes for a really big block of woods. And so back to history. As colonists kept moving west, we cut down trees, we converted land to agriculture. The Civil War hit after Reconstruction. It really began a major timber boom here in the South. And here we had cheap labor and lots of trees. And so all of this combined to really put pressure on these hardwood forests, especially. There was pressure on pine forests, but pine forests, just by nature, they can regenerate a lot faster, especially than these bottomland species. A lot of our bottomland hardwood trees are very slow growing. So in 1913, the Singer Sewing Machine Company bought about a little over 80,000 acres in Northeast Louisiana that became known as the Singer Tract. And that's what is now Tensas River National Wildlife Refuge. But a lot of people know about the Singer Tract who don't even know about the refuge because of the connection with ivory-billed woodpeckers. But it was purchased by Singer specifically for the sweet gum trees. And if any of you all have family or grandparents or great-grandparents who had any of the large Singer sewing machines that had their own built-in cabinet that kind of like it was a one-piece unit, that's why Singer Sewing Machine Company bought this property, because they made those cabinets out of sweet gum trees. And I mean, there's sweet gum trees that are 5 and 6 feet in diameter on this refuge to this day. It's absolutely incredible. So they purchased this property for about $19 an acre. They later expanded it, and it was immediately designated as a quote unquote refuge. And so they did not want people harvesting trees, and they did not want people hunting. Now, if you know anything about Tensas, even today, you know good and well that both of those things happened on the Singer Tract. And so they needed to have wardens and law enforcement, and they offered it to the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. They ended up hiring these wardens. This photo is actually of J.J. Kuhn, who was extremely influential with the ivory-billed woodpecker research that went on. And he was just a really interesting and incredible human being. And so in 1924, Dr. Allen from Cornell visited Florida, got these photos. And then a few years later, Mason Spencer, who I believe was a state legislator, I'm not 100% sure on that, but I believe that he actually shot and harvested an ivory-billed woodpecker on the Singer Tract. And that was kind of the next known place where they were seen. So that then spurred this 1935 Cornell expedition. And this is the expedition that resulted in those really famous audio recordings and visual recordings too. And I used to have a link in this presentation that you can actually see and hear, but for whatever reason it quit working with PowerPoint. So if that's something that y'all are interested in, I can email it out to the group afterwards. Bette J, just let me know, because we do have access to that through the refuge, and it's pretty interesting to watch and hear. But it's also interesting to me to think about the logistics of actually pulling this off. And so if you've ever done any walking in the swamps any time of year, you can see exactly what they encountered and trying to come in with wagons and very heavy recording equipment and mules. And I mean, just the sheer logistics of what they must have done to try to get these recordings is pretty amazing to think about. And this is the machinery that they were actually working with.
Hold tight, everybody. I'm sure she'll be back in a minute.
Okay, I think I'm back.
You're back.
Let me try switching to the wireless and see if that does any better. Okay, it's thinking. Let me share my screen again. I thought that by coming to the refuge, we would have internet. Apparently, I made a poor decision in that case. All right, can y'all still see and hear me?
We can, yes.
Okay. Well, I just switched to the wireless, and so let me see if that does any better. So back to Tensas, 1937, Tanner came back. At this point, Singer Sewing Machine Company started selling off property, and they sold to local lumber companies, and massive timber harvest began. And so we had some that went to the Tyndall Lumber Company, and then a lot of the remaining, I think it was about 60,000 acres, went to Chicago Mill and Lumber Company. And you'll still hear a lot of kind of the old timers around the refuge talk about the old Chicago Mill property. And essentially they're talking about what is now mostly refuge. It did not all become refuge, but a good portion of it became our modern day Tensas Refuge. And so that was when most of the refuge was harvested. Most of the timber was cut. And that's a big misconception with Tensas, is a lot of people believe that it's quote unquote virgin timber, never been cut. There are a few cypress trees here and there that have probably not been cut, but by and large, almost all the trees on Tensas have been harvested at some point. So in 1940, they tried to protect it as a national park. It failed in 1943. And then in 1944, Don Eccleberry spent 2 weeks observing the last known ivory-billed woodpecker. And he created some absolutely beautiful paintings that are very well known. And this is the last universally accepted sighting in the United States. There's people who, there was the Big Cache River sighting. I believe that was in the early 2000s, maybe. And it was never 100% confirmed. There's been people who have thought they've seen them on Tensas since, but in terms of just universal acceptance with photos and audio, this sighting in 1944 on Tensas is the last one. So fast forward, and finally, in 1980, the actual refuge was established. And what's interesting to me about this refuge in particular is, so when every refuge is established, they're established with refuge purposes. And we call this the establishing legislation. And Tensas is the only refuge in this entire system of 560 plus refuges that actually talks about timber management and continued timber harvest. Typically, you get this very cookie cutter protection of wetlands or protection of waterfowl, but Tensas, they actually made provision for continued timber harvest and commercial timber harvest. And so this continues to be a major management goal, if not what I would say the foremost management goal for the refuge, is to continue to harvest timber. Now, they do it today. We do it for wildlife. It's all in accordance with what we call DFCs, or desired forest conditions. And so when we go in to harvest timber, and this applies to Black Bayou, this applies to Upper Ouachita, this applies to Darbone as well, we have certain wildlife goals and parameters in mind. So we preserve species diversity. We're not just taking out the trees that fetch a good price at market. We preserve snags, we preserve cavity trees, anything that has these kind of intrinsic wildlife value, we preserve. And on Tensas, there's actually, I believe, about 8,000 acres that's set aside as a no-cut area as well. So we don't harvest timber in there, but on the vast majority of the rest of the refuge, there is sustainable timber harvest. But again, it is with the primary goal of enhancing wildlife habitat. So that's my Tensas spiel. And please feel free to ask questions either now or later. And I will kind of shift gears and move to Black Bayou now. Excuse me. And so it was too much to put in this presentation to really talk about all of my refuges, including Upper and Darbone, in addition to Black Bayou. So I focused more on Black Bayou, but again, please ask questions. Upper and Darbone are both absolutely fascinating refuges. They've really, they're pretty cool. If you've not gotten out on them just to walk in the woods, I highly encourage it. But in terms of Black Bayou itself, Black Bayou is, other than Handy Break, the smallest of the refuges that I manage. It's only about 5,300 acres, and about 1,500 of that is the lake itself. And the refuge, it's a pretty new refuge. It was established in 1997. And most of the acres, the Fish and Wildlife Service actually owns, but the lake itself is still owned by the city of Monroe. And we just have a 99-year lease and management authority. But, excuse me, city of Monroe wanted to keep actual ownership of the lake because they use it as a backup drinking water source. So when Bayou Desiered gets too low, they use water from the lake. And most of the property immediately surrounding the lake is a former plantation. And there's essentially two different names that it's gone by. I believe it was Richland and Harper at one point. And so the house that I'm sitting in right now, the visitor center, it was actually the former plantation house. And it was built, depending on who you talk to, it was built either in the late 1800s or early 1900s. Some of the history that the Friends group has says the late 1800s. Our Fish and Wildlife Service archaeologist seems to think that that original house burned down and this one was rebuilt in the early 1900s. But regardless, it's an old, beautiful home. We also have two cemeteries on the refuge, and they are old sharecropper cemeteries is what people have told us. And we've had a guy from Louisiana Historic Preservation Office, I believe, came and looked at them. I believe it was maybe 3.5 years ago or so. And he told us that the St. Timothy Cemetery, excuse me, which is the one closest to kind of the railroad tracks, closest to 165, it's the smaller one. He said it probably has between 75 and 100 people buried there. And the larger one, Buffering Cemetery up north of our maintenance shop complex, it has probably between 200 to 300 people buried there. And that's kind of one of our pet projects for the future, is to try to figure out a better way to interpret and tell the story of what's there, and really, you know, connect with families and connect with these local communities who have people here in these cemeteries. So in terms of habitat, bottomland hardwood plantings and plantations on this west side of the refuge that's right around the visitor center. And then on the north and east portions of the refuge, we have just beautiful mixed pine, upland, hardwood uplands. And most people don't know about that part of Black Bayou. And I encourage everybody who has an interest in just conservation in general and in the local area, don't just stick to this visitor center area here at Black Bayou. Go up to the north and east parts of the refuge, because they are just so different. It's very hilly. There's a lot of shortleaf pine mixed in, especially on the north part. It's a really interesting forest community, and not many people realize that it's there. And we do have trails. It's an ATV trail, but it's completely available for hiking and bicycling as well. So I included a few pictures of the old house because people just always love this house, and it's a beautiful story about that the Friends group was able to accomplish with getting it moved, and the amount of volunteer labor that went into it. So this is where it used to sit. This is actually right in front of our maintenance shop compound. And they ended up moving the house all the way down the road to where it currently sits here at the visitor center. And this is where it sits now. And you can see there's big gaping holes in the roof. I mean, the amount of work that went into this building was absolutely incredible. And so here's a picture that I love. This picture is actually from Richland Place Road at the main big sign when you first come onto the refuge. And now you couldn't see the visitor center if your life depended on it because of tree plantings and just the kind of the general way that things have grown up. But in 1997, 1998, when this picture was taken, this is what we had. It was old cotton ground. It was former agricultural land. And so we went in and started replanting it, and really the refuge looks so different than it did even 30 years ago. So in terms of the refuge itself, we have what is, to my mind, both a blessing and a curse of being pretty urban in location, and we get a lot of visitation. So we installed some traffic counters a few years ago, and just based on vehicle use and estimating only 2 people per vehicle, which I think is a pretty low estimate, we're getting over 140,000 visitors a year here at this refuge. For a 5,000 acre refuge, that is a tremendous load and a tremendous lift. But the blessing part of it is that we have a tremendous opportunity for education and interpretation. During a normal year, now COVID has absolutely thrown us for a loop, but during a normal year, we see anywhere between 5,000 to 8,000 kids a year from the local communities who come out for field trips, who come out with Girl Scouts, all these various community groups who come out for events. It's really a neat way that we can give back to the public and offer these opportunities. The other popular uses for the refuge include fishing, hunting, hiking, wildlife observation. I mean, you name it, people come out here to do it. Right now, we're in a little bit of flux as well because our pier and boardwalk, which is by far the most used portion of the refuge, they're closed. They were damaged in the flood in 2016. And so we applied for funding through the Federal Highways Administration, and then we had multiple catastrophic hurricanes that hit other parts of the country, and funding kept getting diverted. And so finally, in 2020, we were able to start the replacement process. And so it's getting very close to being done. Hopefully within the next month to 2 months, we will have an open pier and boardwalk for people to walk on again. That's probably the number one question that I get is, when is the pier going to be back open? And it's, I can tell you the final finished product is going to be absolutely incredible. It really is looking good out there, and people are going to be very happy with it. So for us at this refuge, in terms of habitat management, our probably number one goal and activity that we have to do is invasive species control. And unfortunately, that's just the nature of the beast. The big one for us is aquatics out in the lake itself. We spend a tremendous amount of time and money and energy treating giant salvinia, water hyacinth. Cuban bulrush is our newest invasive species. It came in just within the last maybe 2 years or so. Giant salvinia really exploded after the flood in 2016. And giant salvinia is just an absolutely awful one to have to deal with, because it can actually, during the peak growing season, it can double its biomass every 2 to 7 days. So you think about, you start with just a little clump of salvinia that comes in on somebody's boat, and within just 2 weeks, it has literally grown exponentially, and it can choke out water bodies, It's very, very difficult to kill. It reproduces asexually. It is just an absolutely awful one. And so we spend a lot of time dealing with giant salvinia. The water hyacinth is much, much easier to deal with. Cuban bulrush seems to concentrate where there is salvinia and hyacinth. So essentially by killing one, we can kind of kill all three in some cases. We also have problems on land. Chinese tallow tree is our biggest terrestrial invasive species that we deal with. And we do also funnel a tremendous amount of grant money through this refuge. Last year, we got a cleaning station that was about a $30,000 grant that was given to us to put at the boat ramp to try to provide fishermen and paddlers with the ability to kind of clean their craft and make sure that they're not bringing any of these invasive species out with them to introduce to other lakes and vice versa. And we also get a couple of grants each year, typically for tallow tree removal and spraying. So this is by far our most active habitat management activity that we do on the refuge. And it's being an urban refuge and having so much fishing and other visitation, it's just the hand that we're dealt, and we'll be dealing with it for forever probably. We also have all of these plantings of bottomland hardwoods, and we will actually hopefully be thinning them this coming year. And so basically what happens, and this has happened across the Mississippi alluvial valley, is as these agricultural lands are basically reclaimed and gone, you know, we get them and they enter into either easements or become refuges or things like that. We go back and we plant hardwood seedlings on these refuges just to kind of help speed up the forest establishment and reestablish species diversity that we want. But what happens is after about 20 years, you see what has happened here, what's happened at Tensas, what's happened at all these other refuges. And these trees have grown and they've grown well, but they've now shaded out the understory. And so there's very, very little, you can see it in this picture, there's very, very little regeneration that's happening. There's very, very little forage and browse for deer, for other wildlife species that really rely on kind of the soft herbaceous plants that require sunlight to grow. And so it's time now for these plantations that we're going to go in and we're going to actually thin them. And the ones here, we will just be chipping the trees. It's going to look a little messy at first, but the impacts to the habitat and the benefits of wildlife, I mean, you can't put a dollar price on that. It's going to be really, really tremendous if you come back in a couple years. We also have a fire program. For the most part, we just burn the prairie right now. Eventually, I would love to be able to burn the north and east sides, especially concentrating on those areas where we still have these remnant shortleaf pine trees, and see if maybe we can release some young shortleaf and really kind of reestablish that community. There's many, many issues and problems with fire. It's a highly, highly regulated activity as a federal agency, but that I would absolutely love to be able to get some fire up in our uplands on the north and east side. So eventually, hopefully that'll be the goal, but right now we'll continue burning the prairie pretty much annually, and that should be happening maybe even this week for this year. And then for habitat management as well, I always include hunting, because hunting on this refuge especially is a habitat management tool. And basically what it does is it maintains deer herds at or below carrying capacity. And what this means in reality is that when you have closed areas and you have hunting all around, deer tend to concentrate in these closed areas, and they will absolutely eat themselves out of house and home. They'll get skinny, they congregate together, it's easier for them to transmit diseases. It's just not a healthy situation for deer. And so hunting not only removes individuals from the population, but it also helps move them around. And so we no longer have wolves, we no longer have panthers, we don't have these natural predators of deer. And so humans have to sometimes step in and become those predators, essentially, for the system to continue to function and be healthy. So I always include hunting when talking about this refuge and stress that it is a habitat management tool. It's a public use that we promote and that we allow, but first and foremost, to my mind, it's a tool to make sure that our forests stay healthy. So in terms of future management for the refuge, it's going to be a lot of what we're doing now in terms of invasives and timber management. What I see is kind of the number one goal moving forward is to figure out the balance between public use and managing our impacts as we are in this increasingly urbanized setting. So we're seeing it now with portrait photographers coming out and throwing confetti and glitter, and not just to pick on them, but we've had major issues with that. We have issues with people coming and littering. We have issues, I mean, you name it. We have from drug deals to everything else. It all goes down on Black Bayou, and it's because it is a refuge within a fairly urban setting. And we've seen Egret Landing go in on the west side right here around the visitor center, and that has presented some challenges. Now, for the most part, the homeowners have been very good to work with, but again, this is going to be the facts moving forward, as we have to figure out how to manage this wild space in the context of humans and more humans and more humans. In terms of the environmental ed and interpretation program, this one is very up in the air as well right now. Most of you probably know that Nova took another position in Kansas last year, and she's doing great, by the way. She's absolutely loving it, and we're still in touch. But I have not been allowed to fill that position yet. Basically, our regional office has to tell us that we can, and they have not told us that we can yet. We've been in years and years and years of budget crunches, and permanent positions are extremely hard to come by. So I'm hopeful that within the next year or two, we'll be able to hire a new park ranger, and that will really determine kind of the future direction of the environmental ed and interpretation program. We're also trying to figure out our new normals with COVID. That has presented its own suite of issues and problems and things that we have to work through. But the good news is that we'll have a new pier and boardwalk, so we will be putting that to good use. And then another thing that we're going to try to concentrate more on moving forward is figuring out how we can connect these historically underserved communities. So things like interpreting the history, things like making sure that the cemeteries are maintained, providing more fishing access. I would love to be able to work with the city of Monroe and get an actual city bus that comes all the way to the refuge, not just a CenturyLink. Maybe a greenway that connects the refuge to kind of the city of Monroe proper. Anyway, we have a lot of different ideas as far as this goes, but this will more than likely be a management goal moving forward as well. So that is all that I had. I realize I talked fast. I was trying to leave a little bit of time for questions. So please feel free to ask questions.
Yes, here's a question. Sorry to trouble you. How deep is the lake at its deepest point?
At its deepest point, it's probably 14 to 16 feet, I would say. On average, it runs probably between 4 to 8.
Right.
Fascinating information, Erin. Thank you. By the way, folks, I think we can probably unmute our video now that she's not presenting on her screen and be okay. And I have a number of questions, but you can ask in the chat if you don't want to unmute yourself. I want to talk a little bit more about the deer herd. Do you have any sense, Erin, of the size of the deer herd? And what are the restrictions on hunting, given it is such a urban setting? What are the restrictions on firearms, sight, etc.?
Right. So in terms of deer herd size, we don't really have numbers in terms of the actual herd. I can tell you what our yearly harvest is. There is no gun hunting for deer anywhere on the refuge.
Really?
Really, it is all archery, only bows. Now, what I ended up having to do, I guess it was about 3 years ago, and it caused a bit of a major uproar, was I actually added 700 acres or so along what used to be the Art Project Road, right when you first come onto the refuge, and then also the section just a little bit up from the boat ramp to our maintenance shop. And all of that historically had been closed. But what happened, like right around the time that I got here, was Egret Landing started getting built up. That used to be a hunting club that was constantly taking does off the property and harvesting deer. We had a couple of years of just excellent mast production. We had a couple of years of excellent reproduction and recruitment. So we had does actually raising twins and triplets to maturity. I mean, it was absolutely crazy. And so basically what we had was, it was so overbrowsed off the Art Project Road that deer were literally eating pine trees. And so deer, I always use the analogy that deer eat like we do. So I may go to my refrigerator, and if I'm hungry and there's, a big steak and, yummy vegetables and things like, that's what I'm going to eat first. I might not go for the cabbage or the asparagus, or now I personally love asparagus, but typically that gets an ooh from people. But deer are the same way. So they will take these high nutrient, good tasting foods first, and pine trees are not high nutrient and they are not tasty. And so we worked with the state to try to get a handle on how bad a shape our deer herd was really in, because I was simultaneously getting photos from photographers of extremely skinny deer. Obviously, we had a deer herd health program or problem. And so that led us to actually expanding the acreage where you can bow hunt. Now, what that has done is it has obviously created this opportunity for kind of clash between hunters, photographers, people out hiking, things like that. But bow hunting is an extremely safe method of hunting. And for our case, it actually, our deer harvest went from, I think it was 26 deer total over the course of the whole year, over the whole 5,000 acres. We opened an additional 700 acres and our harvest only jumped to about 42. So our harvest didn't even double, but what it did was having the hunters in there in the woods, it helped push the deer around. And so they didn't just congregate in these closed areas and just eat themselves out of house and home. And so that was kind of what happened with that. It is bow only across the whole refuge. We're working on potentially trying to, in the future, if this becomes a worse problem, I have no intentions of doing it now, but we may end up doing like a 2-day shotgun hunt, which would essentially you're able to take out more deer in a short amount of time.
Right.
But we're not set up for that yet.
Okay. I'm familiar with that because in Pennsylvania they had a shotgun hunt close to urban areas. There's a real problem with deer around the cities in a place like Pennsylvania because they don't get hunted as much, and so they have a shotgun season where you shoot a slug in your shotgun and and it's safer for urban areas. Thank you. That's very interesting. What is the browse that you do try to encourage at Black Bayou? Anything like smilax? Do you try to encourage smilax growth for deer browse, or anything in particular that you try to encourage?
We really just want those early successional species coming up wherever there's sunlight hitting the forest floor. So you end up, they love asters, they love like strawberry bush. There's some kind of these very, very preferred herbaceous species. They do like smilax. They tend to like the grasses and flowers first and foremost before they go more towards the vines and the woodier things. But there are some woody plants that they will absolutely chow down on as well. You just about can't find like a strawberry bush that's not been just absolutely nipped to it.
I have actually heard that the strawberry bushes are kind of like deer cocaine. They really love them. Talk a little bit about the duck stamp. David Hoover and I had a question. I want to know more about that too. I did not know that that's what the price of a duck stamp went for. I really did not know that.
Yes, and so it looks like Terry sent the link out in the chat as well. And so a duck stamp is essentially you have to have it for hunting, and I think that was initially why it was established, with the idea that, well, these hunters are taking ducks, and by taking, I just mean harvesting. Hunters are harvesting ducks, and so by way of kind of giving back to habitat and to conservation, they started having hunters buy these duck stamps. And Ding Darling was kind of he was the director of what is now the Fish and Wildlife Service at the time. He was a famous cartoonist. There's a refuge named after him down at Sanibel Island. And so he kind of came up with this concept and drew the first duck stamp, I believe. And so, excuse me, what it has evolved to is, and I think you can buy them online, and you can buy them at most post offices. Those are the two places that I know of that you can buy them. And I think they've gone up to $25, I think, for a year, either 20 or 25. But again, when you think about it in context of 98 cents, and I'm not good at math, but if you take 98% of $25, that money goes directly to purchasing property or purchasing easements. And for the most part, it goes under Fish and Wildlife Service Administration. Most of it goes to like the prairie pothole region up in North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, places like that. It tends to be concentrated on waterfowl breeding areas. And down here, we don't have as much waterfowl breeding area outside of wood ducks. So we don't see as much direct duck stamp dollar impact down here. But the ducks that come in the wintertime have to breed somewhere. And so regardless, I encourage everybody, whether you hunt, whether you bird watch, whether you do anything, buy your duck stamp every year. Plus they're really pretty. They're little, and sometimes you can buy commemorative prints as well. There's a big contest actually each year. It's an art contest, and there's also a junior duck stamp that kids can participate in. So it's just all around, it's just a really cool program that not many people know much about.
So is it like a hunting license, or
is it a picture?
Or a picture, or what would you call it?
Yeah, I guess I would call it, so it's an actual stamp. It's like a postage stamp, but it's bigger, and it has the picture on it, but it comes on like a license. And so when you go out hunting, like when I go duck hunting, I have to make sure that I have my duck stamp and that it's signed. You actually have to sign the front like you do your hunting license when you sign it. But it's really, you know, I know people that buy them and like frame them, or they get it each year and they put the stamp, you know, they've come up with these very elaborate decorative ways to do it as well.
The picture on the stamp is usually a reproduction of a painting, David. So that actually, what you just said, Erin, I realized as you were talking about this, I have a duck stamp print. I purchased it many, many years ago when I lived in Iowa, but it's like this, and I framed it, and I still have it. It's a framed print. They're always limited editions. And the paintings, the prints that they are made from are beautiful. They're gorgeous representations of aquatic birds, of ducks typically. So I don't know if they still sell the big prints, but I've got one.
I think that they do.
Erin, in the future, it's been suggested that there's going to be a lot of money being invested into carbon sequestration. Do you think that the refuge complex could benefit from land acquisition for carbon sequestration plantations, so to speak, of native hardwoods?
That one I think is both a yes and a no kind of question. So we actually a lot of land at Upper Ouachita, for example, and also on Tensas, probably I'd say 15,000 acres on Tensas was actually replanted for carbon sequestration. And so this has been an ongoing kind of project or means and methods to help achieve conservation goals for us in the Mississippi Alluvial Valley for, I would say, decades now. Now, the interesting thing about it, and they're starting to do more research about how much carbon mature forests sequester, and you know, how do you, what is the compensation like for private landowners if they enroll their property in certain farm bill programs? You know, how much carbon is a mature bald cypress forest sequestering, or things like that. Now, for us, in terms of acquisition, unfortunately, and I don't want to just like depress all of you all, but we are in dire straits as an agency in terms of staffing. And so we're at a point where, like, there's a proposal that we might actually get about another 18,000 acres to add to Upper Ouachita within the next maybe 5 to 10 years. And it just makes me cringe. The conservationist in me is so excited, but the practical manager wants to know, how on earth are we going to do this? Because right now we have one law enforcement officer stretched across the entire complex from Texas to Mississippi.
Good Lord.
I have 4 refuges. Upper Ouachita essentially functions as 2 separate refuges because you have to go from one side of the Ouachita River to the other. And it's, you know, going from essentially north of Bastrop all the way around to like Mary and Hale area. So it really functions as 2 different refuges.
Yes.
I have about 100 acres of roads and ATV trails, 75,000 acres, active timber programs, active biology programs. We're down to 1 maintenance guy. So for us, it's like, big picture, yes, we love the idea of being able to protect more land, but when it's like nuts and bolts, we're kind of at a point where we're like, no more, not until we get more people. So I will be much more excited about our ability to impact habitat and habitat quality on the ground once we can start hiring more staff.
Yes.
Get that totally. David Hoover, do you have another question?
What is chipping the trees?
So essentially it is kind of mulching them down, kind of like you would grind a stump in your front yard. We have gone back and forth with trying to find somebody who will come and kind of harvest them commercially. And so we're hopeful that the logger that we'll have do it will be able to take the chips and you know, they'll go for paper production or things like that. We've had a lot going on with, you know, GP shut down in Crossit, and there's like a lot of things with timber markets. So we're not real sure where the chips are actually going to go, but it essentially grinds the trees up and into something that can be used for pulp. And all these timber projects on any of our refuges, the money that we get from that, basically we put it out for bid, and loggers can bid on whatever we define as the parameters. We typically mark the trees. They can't cut anything that's not marked. It's done in a very, very low ecological impact in terms of, you know, we keep them out when it's wet. We don't let them just absolutely rut up the world. And the money, it does not come directly back into our budget. It goes into the general treasury, but we do get forestry allocations each year. And so we end up getting like a piece or a portion of the money back to the refuges. But again, our thing is not the money, it's the wildlife and the habitat benefits. And so I always tell people all the time, nature is messy, and wildlife managers are in the habit of imitating Mother Nature. And so you think about how Mother Nature helps our forests regenerate and helps keep browse in the forest floor, and you think about hurricanes and everything that happened with that this year. You think about tornadoes, you think about floods. And so that's what we're mimicking on a small scale. And so people see us come in with loggers and chainsaws, and we're burning things and we're killing things, and they're like, oh my God, what are you doing? Y'all don't care at all about the environment, when in reality it could not be more different. Those are just the tools that we have at our disposal.
we need to move on to our meeting pretty quickly. I just have one more quick question. Is there anything we can do to help you get a new ranger? We all miss Nova, okay?
Right.
We
Oh my
think that that's a
gosh.
huge loss that the kids aren't coming out there and getting the benefit of her. And so is there anything we can do to help you get another ranger?
The best thing that you can do, and this is where I have to walk a fine line as a federal employee, but talk to the Friends of Black Bayou. And you can also contact your local politicians, and you can tell them what this refuge means to you. You can tell them the impact that the educator has, and you can get them in touch with our regional office in Atlanta. And that is, I can get that contact information to y'all via the Friends group. But that's the best thing to do is really, and I can just say, like, the politicians love the personal stories. And so that is what I know that the Friends group has always had good success doing, is kind of telling the story of what this refuge means to people.
Yeah.
So that's the best way
Okay.
to go about it.
Kind of what I thought, but wanted to hear you say it.
Yep.
Thank you.
No, thank you all.
Other burning questions, or are we ready to let Erin go and move on to our meeting? Very wonderfully informative, and I'm so excited. And oh, you know what? I don't know, maybe I'm doing a bad thing, but when I'm walking on the refuge and I see those little tallow trees, I break them over.
Yes. Just pull them up.
Break them over. I can't pull them out.
Absolutely.
I break them over.
Yes. No, every bit of help is appreciated for sure. So, but no, I appreciate it. And I will make sure that my contact information gets out. I encourage anybody to reach out to me anytime. My cell phone is usually the best way to get a hold of me, cell phone or email. I tend to be pretty scattered, and like this week, we're hopefully going to be doing some prescribed burning on Darbone starting tomorrow. So
you have a lot of territory to cover, and we are deeply grateful for everything that you do. And especially for, I mean, we're all interested. We go to Tensas, we go to Darbone, we go to all of them. We really do. Black Bayou is sort of because it's close and we can get there easily, right. But we are deeply grateful for all you do and are ready and willing to help if we can. So
much appreciated.
Yeah.
Much appreciated. Well, thank y'all so much.
Thank you. Let's give a round of applause one way or another. Thank you, Erin.
Thank you all. I hope you have a good rest of your weekend.
We will.